What would you do if you found yourself alone in the sky, outnumbered 40-1 with enemy fighters closing in from every direction? Most men would pray, some would run, but one American farm boy from South Dakota did something that defied every rule of aerial combat. He turned directly into the swarm and attacked. This is the story of a man who became a legend in a single afternoon over the Pacific, a pilot whose name struck fear into the hearts of Japanese aviators and whose achievements were so extraordinary that even his own commanders initially refused to believe them. Today we're diving deep into one of the most astonishing displays of courage and skill in the history of aerial warfare, a day when the underestimated became unstoppable, when a young man who grew up fixing tractors became the deadliest predator in the sky. His name was Joe Foss, and on January 25, 1943, he proved that heroes aren't born, they're forged in the crucible of impossible odds. Joseph Jacob Foss was born on April 17, 1915, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, about as far from the ocean as you can get in America. He grew up during the Great Depression on a farm where survival meant fixing machinery with your bare hands and making do with whatever you had. His father died when Joe was 17, forcing him to shoulder responsibilities that would have crushed most boys his age. He kept the farm running, put himself through school, and developed a work ethic that treated impossible as just another word for difficult. When most young men his age were thinking about girls and weekends, Foss was thinking about flying. He'd seen a pilot perform aerobatics at a county fair when he was a child, and the sight of that airplane dancing through the sky planted a seed that never stopped growing. But there was a problem, a significant one. By the time America entered World War II, Foss was already 26 years old, ancient by military aviation standards. The Marine Corps had an age limit of 25 for flight training. He was, by official standards, too old to fight. Most men would have accepted this verdict. Joe Foss lied about his age. He wasn't going to let a number on paper keep him from the sky. He trained with younger pilots who looked at this older farm boy with skepticism. What was this guy doing here? Shouldn't he be behind a desk somewhere? But Foss had something they didn't: patience honed by years of farm work, mechanical intuition from fixing equipment, and an absolute refusal to quit that came from surviving the Depression. The moment that would define his entire life came when he received orders to Guadalcanal in October 1942. This wasn't training anymore. This was the real war, and it was brutal. Guadalcanal was hell with palm trees. When Foss arrived at Henderson Field, he walked into a meat grinder. The airstrip was under constant bombardment, supplies were scarce, and pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Japanese controlled the skies during much of the day, and their Zero fighters were flown by veteran pilots who had been at war since 1937. These weren't rookies. These were some of the most experienced combat aviators in the world. Foss was assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 121, flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. On paper, the Wildcat was inferior to the Zero in almost every way: slower, less maneuverable, and with a lower rate of climb. Japanese pilots called American fighters easy prey. They had good reason for that confidence. They'd been winning. But Foss understood something fundamental about aerial combat that many of his fellow pilots missed. It wasn't about having the best plane. It was about using your plane's strengths and exploiting your enemy's weaknesses. The Wildcat couldn't outturn a Zero, but it could outdive it. It was built like a tank, capable of absorbing punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. And Foss was a patient hunter who understood that the key to survival wasn't fancy aerobatics. It was positioning, discipline, and nerve. He studied the Japanese tactics obsessively. He learned their patterns, their preferences, their mistakes. He discovered that Zero pilots, confident in their aircraft's superiority, often became overconfident. They would pursue a damaged American plane too aggressively, separating from their formations. They would commit to turns that left them vulnerable, and Foss learned to recognize these moments and exploit them with devastating efficiency. His first kills came in quick succession: one Zero, then another, then three in a single day. His squadron mates began to notice that this older pilot, the farm boy they'd underestimated, was consistently bringing down enemy aircraft. But nobody, including Foss himself, could have predicted what was about to happen on that January afternoon. January 25, 1943, began like most days at Henderson Field, with uncertainty. Intelligence reported a massive Japanese formation heading toward Guadalcanal. The numbers were staggering. Dozens of bombers escorted by swarms of Zero fighters. Every available American aircraft was scrambled to intercept them. Foss took off as part of the defensive force, but aerial combat never goes according to plan. Formations scatter, communications break down. Within minutes of engaging the enemy, Foss found himself separated from his wingmen, alone in a sky filled with Japanese aircraft. Here's where the story becomes almost mythical. Most pilots in this situation would have disengaged, used their altitude advantage to escape, and lived to fight another day. It would have been the smart, tactical choice. But Joe Foss looked at that massive formation and made a different calculation. These bombers were heading toward American positions, toward his brothers on the ground, and someone had to stop them. So he attacked, not cautiously, not defensively. He drove straight into the formation like a linebacker breaking through a line. His first target was a bomber, a quick burst from his .650 caliber machine guns, and it began trailing smoke. He rolled away from the return fire, selected another target, fired again. Another bomber damaged. The Japanese fighters began reacting, turning toward this lone American who had somehow materialized in the middle of their formation. What happened next defied conventional aerial combat doctrine. Foss didn't run. He stayed in the fight, using every ounce of skill, every bit of tactical knowledge he'd accumulated. He would attack, break away using the Wildcat's superior diving speed, climb back into position, and attack again, over and over. The Japanese pilots couldn't understand what they were seeing. One American fighter was disrupting their entire formation. He shot down one Zero, then another. He damaged a bomber so severely, it fell out of formation. He became a ghost in the sky, appearing from impossible angles, firing with precision that seemed almost supernatural, then vanishing before the Japanese could coordinate a response. The farm boy, who had grown up timing his movements to the rhythm of seasons and machinery, was now operating at a tempo that overwhelmed trained military pilots. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing a single American fighter weaving through the enemy formation like a needle through cloth. Japanese pilots later reported encountering a demon pilot who seemed to be everywhere at once. But it wasn't supernatural, it was simply a man operating at the absolute peak of his abilities, sustained by pure determination and fighting skill honed to perfection. When Foss finally landed, his Wildcat was riddled with bullet holes. He'd been in continuous combat for over an hour. His ammunition was exhausted. His fuel gauge was reading empty. He climbed out of the cockpit, and his crew chief stared at the damage in disbelief. How was this airplane still flying? The initial reports seemed impossible. Foss claimed multiple kills. The exact number was still being verified through witness accounts and gun camera footage. Other pilots confirmed seeing him engage the enemy formation alone. Intelligence officers began piecing together what had happened, and the picture that emerged was staggering. In that single mission, Joe Foss had shot down 4 enemy aircraft confirmed, with several more probables. But that was just January 25th. When combined with his previous missions, his total score was approaching the legendary mark set by Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I. 26 confirmed victories, making him America's top ace of that war. The question facing military leadership became, how do you replicate this? How do you train this kind of skill? And the answer was both simple and profound. You couldn't simply train it. What made Foss exceptional wasn't just his flying ability, it was the complete package. His patience, his discipline, his work ethic, his willingness to study the enemy, his courage under fire, and his absolute refusal to quit even when every rational calculation said he should. But there were lessons that could be extracted. Foss demonstrated that aircraft limitations could be overcome through superior tactics. He proved that disciplined aggression, knowing when to press an attack and when to break away, was more valuable than reckless bravery. He showed that patient observation of enemy patterns could create exploitable opportunities. And perhaps most importantly, he embodied the idea that your background doesn't determine your ceiling. A farm boy from South Dakota could become the deadliest pilot in the Pacific. By the end of his tour at Guadalcanal, Foss had tied Rickenbacker's record with 26 confirmed kills. He would have certainly exceeded it, but physical exhaustion and malaria forced him to return stateside. He'd lost 30 pounds. His hands shook from fatigue. But he'd done something that seemed impossible. He'd taken on the best the Japanese Empire could throw at him, and won. The story of Joe Foss raises profound questions about how we identify and cultivate excellence. By conventional standards, he should never have been in that cockpit. He was too old. He didn't come from a wealthy family with connections. He had no prior military experience. Every institutional barrier said no, and he ignored them all. This challenges our modern obsession with credentials and pedigree. We've built systems designed to identify talent early and funnel it through approved channels. We look for the right schools, the right background, the right age. But Foss is a reminder that exceptional ability often comes from unexpected places and doesn't announce itself with perfect credentials. There's also a darker question worth considering. Foss was fighting for survival, for his squadron, for the Marines on Guadalcanal, for his country. His actions were heroic within that context. But war is tragedy, and even the most justified combat carries moral weight. The Japanese pilots he shot down were men too. Many of them skilled, brave, and fighting for what they believed was their duty. Foss himself never glorified killing. He spoke about his missions with respect for his opponents and sadness at the waste of war. Compare Foss to other legendary warriors throughout history. Like Audie Murphy, he was underestimated because of his background and appearance. Like Sergeant York in World War I, he brought rural American values, patience, self-reliance, marksmanship, into modern combat and found they were still relevant. But unlike some military heroes who became career warriors, Foss returned to civilian life and spent decades in public service, eventually becoming governor of South Dakota. The war was something he survived, not something that defined his entire existence. His story also illuminates the difference between courage and recklessness. Foss took extraordinary risks, but they were calculated risks. He knew his aircraft's capabilities. He studied his enemy. He didn't charge blindly into danger. He charged with preparation and skill. This distinction matters because true courage isn't the absence of fear or the embrace of unnecessary risk. It's acting despite fear, with full knowledge of the dangers, because something greater demands it. Joe Foss received the Medal of Honor from President Franklin Roosevelt in May 1943. The citation described his remarkable flying skill and inspiring leadership, but those words barely capture what he accomplished. He'd taken the skills learned on a South Dakota farm, patience, mechanical understanding, refusal to quit, and transformed them into mastery of one of the most demanding challenges humans have ever faced: aerial combat against trained enemy pilots trying to kill you. After the war, Foss could have traded on his fame, could have spent the rest of his life being the hero ace. Instead, he went back to South Dakota and built a life. He founded an airline. He served in the state legislature. He became governor. He was the first commissioner of the American Football League, helping build what would eventually become part of the modern NFL. He spent years working with underprivileged youth, believing that opportunity should be available to everyone, not just those who fit traditional molds. When asked about his wartime service later in life, Foss didn't tell war stories for entertainment. He talked about the men who didn't come home. He talked about responsibility and sacrifice. He remained humble about accomplishments that would have made most men insufferable. And when pressed about that January day, when he took on 40 enemy aircraft alone, his response was characteristically simple: someone had to do it. That phrase contains a universe of meaning. Someone had to do it, not someone will do it eventually. Not someone should do it if circumstances are perfect. Someone had to do it right now, regardless of odds, regardless of personal risk, regardless of whether anyone would ever know or care. This is what separates those who achieve the impossible from those who accept limitations. Foss saw what needed to happen and made himself the instrument of that necessity. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He didn't demand a better aircraft or more support or ideal circumstances. He worked with what he had and exceeded every reasonable expectation of what one person could accomplish. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Foss spread stories about the American demon in the Wildcat. They learned to respect and fear that particular aircraft's silhouette. What they never learned was that the demon was a farm boy from the middle of nowhere who'd been told he was too old, too inexperienced, too ordinary to be a fighter pilot. Joe Foss lived to be 87 years old, passing away in 2003. He experienced almost 6 decades beyond his combat service, decades filled with family, public service, and quiet heroism that never made headlines. But on that January afternoon in 1943, for one impossible hour over Guadalcanal, a man touched something eternal, the absolute limit of human courage and skill under pressure. The next time you face impossible odds, remember the farm boy who was too old to fly. Remember that credentials matter less than character. Remember that patient preparation can overcome raw talent. Remember that one person, properly positioned and absolutely committed, can disrupt any formation. And remember that heroes aren't the people who never feel fear. Heroes are the people who feel the fear, measure the odds, count the cost, and then do what needs to be done anyway. Because sometimes someone simply has to do it. What if I told you that one of the most lethal tank destroyers of World War II was built on a lie? That American engineers created a weapon so fast, so devastating, that German tank commanders who survived encounters with it reported feeling hunted rather than engaged in battle. The M18 Hellcat wasn't supposed to exist, at least not in the form it took. It violated every principle of armored warfare that military strategists had established. It was too light, too fast, too exposed. When German crews first encountered it in the hedgerows of France in 1944, many dismissed it as a desperate American improvisation, a tin can on tracks that would crumple under the first shot from a Panther or Tiger. They laughed at its open turret, mocked its thin armor, and predicted easy kills. Then the Hellcats started moving, and the laughter died in throats that would never draw another breath. This is the story of how American ingenuity turned weakness into the deadliest strength on the battlefield, and how a vehicle designed around a single radical principle, shoot first, never get shot, rewrote the rules of armored combat. This is the story of the tank destroyer that German veterans came to fear more than any other American vehicle, the machine that proved speed kills faster than armor protects. The M18 Hellcat entered service in July 1943, the brainchild of a doctrine that most military planners considered suicidal. While other nations built heavier, more heavily armored fighting vehicles, the United States Tank Destroyer Force had committed to a radical philosophy: mobility over protection, firepower over armor, aggression over defense. The Hellcat embodied this doctrine so completely that it became both the doctrine's greatest vindication and its most controversial expression. Weighing just under 18 tons, less than half the weight of a Sherman tank, and a fraction of the German vehicles it would face, the M18 mounted a powerful 76mm gun in an open-top turret that could traverse 360 degrees in 20 seconds, faster than any tank in the world. Its Wright Continental engine pushed this lightweight frame to speeds exceeding 55 miles per hour on roads, making it the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire war. But here's what made veterans wake up sweating decades later. That speed came at a price measured in fractions of an inch. The Hellcat's armor maxed out at 1 inch thick on the front hull, with sides and rear even thinner. A German 88mm shell could punch through it like a nail through cardboard. The moment that defined the M18's legend came not in a single battle, but in thousands of encounters across France, Belgium, and Germany, where this fundamental trade-off, speed for armor, was tested in the crucible of combat. American crews climbed into these vehicles, knowing that if a German gunner drew a bead on them, there would be no second chances, no lucky deflections off sloped armor, no time to bail out before the ammunition cooked off. They were racing death itself, and the only way to survive was to never stop moving, never present a stationary target, and kill the enemy before he could return fire. The Hellcat story begins not with tanks, but with a mistake that cost thousands of American lives. In the years before Pearl Harbor, Army doctrine had split the armored force into two distinct branches. Tanks would support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, while a separate tank destroyer force would counter enemy armor. This seemed logical on paper, but it created an organizational nightmare and a vehicle development path that initially produced disasters. The early tank destroyers, converted half-tracks and trucks mounting anti-tank guns, proved catastrophically vulnerable in combat. American soldiers died in vehicles that couldn't protect them, couldn't catch German armor, and couldn't survive long enough to use their weapons effectively. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, chief architect of the tank destroyer doctrine, believed fanatically in a simple principle. The best defense against a tank was a faster, more agile vehicle that could outmaneuver it, strike from unexpected angles, and vanish before retaliation. But turning this theory into steel required engineers to abandon every instinct that had guided armored vehicle design since World War I. The Buick Motor Division, tasked with creating this revolutionary vehicle, faced a challenge that seemed impossible: build something that could outrun German armor, destroy it at range, and cost less than a standard tank while being simpler to produce and maintain. The engineers at Buick made choices that horrified traditional armor officers. They stripped away protective steel until the vehicle barely qualified as armored. They used an aircraft engine never intended for ground combat. They left the turret open to the sky, exposing the crew to artillery fragments, grenades, and even small arms fire. They designed a suspension system that prioritized speed over stability, creating a vehicle that could flip if driven carelessly. Every decision reflected a singular, uncompromising vision. This machine existed to kill, not to survive. Its crew's survival depended entirely on their ability to see first, shoot first, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The men assigned to these vehicles came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa, who understood engines, street kids from Brooklyn who thought fast under pressure, college students whose studies had been interrupted by war. They trained at Camp Hood in Texas, where instructors drilled them relentlessly in the tactics that might keep them alive. Never attack from the front, never remain stationary after firing, never assume you've killed what you hit, never trust your armor to save you. These crews learned to think like hunters rather than soldiers, to embrace asymmetric warfare decades before that term entered military vocabulary. The Hellcat represented a philosophical revolution in how America approached armored warfare, a revolution that challenged not just German tactical thinking, but American assumptions about courage, protection, and the moral contract between commanders and soldiers. At its core, the M18 embodied the principle that had defined American warfare since the Revolution: use superior mobility and initiative to offset material disadvantages, fight smart rather than fair, and win by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. This concept, speed as armor, sounds simple until you understand what it demanded from crews. German tankers in Panthers and Tigers fought from mobile fortresses, protected by steel thick enough to shrug off most Allied guns. They could afford mistakes, could take hits and keep fighting, could rely on their armor to give them second chances. Hellcat crews had no such luxury. Every engagement was a calculated gamble with death. They operated in a state of controlled terror, knowing that a single error in judgment, a moment's hesitation or bad luck could transform their vehicle into a crematorium before they could react. The open-top turret, perhaps the Hellcat's most controversial feature, embodied this philosophy perfectly. Critics called it a death trap, arguing that it exposed crews to artillery, mortars, and airbursts. Defenders countered that it provided superior situational awareness, allowed faster escape if the vehicle was hit, and eliminated the claustrophobic terror of being sealed in a steel coffin. The truth lay somewhere between. The open turret forced crews to remain alert, prevented them from developing the false sense of security that got tank crews killed, and reminded them every moment that their survival depended on aggression, awareness, and speed. But here's the deeper truth that military historians still debate. The Hellcat challenged fundamental assumptions about masculine courage and military honor that had defined warfare for centuries. Traditional military culture equated bravery with standing firm under fire, with absorbing punishment and returning it, with frontal assaults and unflinching advance. The Hellcat doctrine inverted this. Courage meant shooting from ambush, retreating before superior force could respond, refusing battle on the enemy's terms. It was Native American warfare transplanted to mechanized combat, and it offended officers raised on notions of fair play and honorable engagement. The Hellcat's tactical employment in combat revealed insights about armored warfare that resonated far beyond World War II, insights that would influence American military doctrine through Korea, Vietnam, and into the modern era. The vehicle proved that in mobile warfare, positioning mattered more than protection, that firing first from an unexpected angle beat trading blows with a better armored opponent, that psychological dominance could be achieved through unpredictability rather than overwhelming force. Hellcat crews developed tactics that read like hunting strategies rather than military doctrine. They learned to use terrain that heavier tanks couldn't navigate: soft ground, narrow forest paths, steep hills that would bog down a panther. They mastered the art of the ambush, hiding in positions that German tankers never considered threatened, waiting until enemy armor exposed its flanks or rear, then striking before the target could rotate its turret. The M18's incredible traverse speed meant that crews could engage targets across a wider arc, faster than any German tank could respond, turning the vehicle's 360-degree field of fire into a decisive advantage. In the hedgerows of Normandy, Hellcats proved devastatingly effective. The bocage country, with its ancient earthen walls topped with thick hedges, created a maze of narrow lanes and small fields that favored ambush over maneuver. German defenders positioned panthers and tigers to cover the obvious approaches, creating killing zones where Allied armor bunched up and died. Hellcats ignored these approaches. They infiltrated through positions heavier tanks couldn't reach, used their speed to reposition after every shot, and disappeared into terrain before German gunners could return fire. Veterans reported engagements lasting seconds. Spot the target, fire, reverse at full speed into cover, relocate and prepare for the next shot. The statistics tell part of the story. The M18 achieved the best kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in the European theater. More than 3 German tanks destroyed for every Hellcat lost, but numbers miss the psychological impact. German tankers who survived encounters with Hellcats reported a profound sense of vulnerability, the terrifying knowledge that death could come from any direction at any moment, that their armor meant nothing against an enemy they couldn't catch or pin down. Prisoners of war spoke of American ghost tanks that appeared, killed and vanished before anyone could respond. This psychological warfare, the creation of an enemy that seemed to violate the rules of conventional combat, represented a force multiplier that no amount of armor plate could match. The Hellcat's success came at a cost that military historians still debate, a cost measured not in strategic outcomes, but in human lives and moral choices. The doctrine that created the M18 demanded that young men accept risks that soldiers in other vehicles didn't face, that they forfeit protection in exchange for the promise of victory through superior tactics. This raised uncomfortable questions. Did commanders have the right to ask soldiers to fight in vehicles they knew couldn't withstand hits? Was the tactical effectiveness worth the psychological burden on crews who lived every mission knowing one mistake meant death? Critics of the tank destroyer doctrine, and by extension the Hellcat, argued that it represented a false economy, that the resources spent developing and deploying these specialized vehicles should have gone toward building more and better tanks. They pointed to the fact that as the war progressed and American armor improved, Shermans equipped with the same 76mm gun could perform the Hellcat's mission while offering better crew protection. They noted that the organizational separation between tanks and tank destroyers created coordination problems and doctrinal confusion that persisted throughout the war. They questioned whether speed and mobility really compensated for vulnerability, or whether Hellcat crews simply got lucky more often than they got hit. These criticisms gained weight from tragic losses. When Hellcats did get caught, pinned by superior numbers, trapped by terrain, or simply victim to the random chance that defines combat, the results were horrific. The thin armor that made the vehicle fast provided no protection when German guns found their mark. The open turret that enhanced awareness also meant that penetrating hits or near misses from artillery could kill or wound the entire crew. The high-power engine that pushed the M18 to extraordinary speeds also meant that fuel fires burned fast and hot, giving crews seconds to escape. Veterans who survived the war carried scars, physical and psychological, from these moments when their speed failed to save them. Yet defenders of the Hellcat point to a deeper truth about armored warfare that the critics missed. Protection is always relative, and in World War II, no Allied tank could reliably withstand hits from German heavy armor at combat ranges. A Sherman's thicker armor might give crews a psychological sense of security, but German 88mm guns punched through it almost as easily as they penetrated Hellcat armor. Given this reality, the M18's doctrine made brutal sense. If you're going to die anyway when hit, better to be fast enough to avoid being hit in the first place. Better to kill the enemy before he can shoot, rather than hope your armor saves you after he does. The Hellcat also forced a reckoning with American cultural myths about warfare and masculinity. The vehicle succeeded precisely because it rejected the frontal assault, the stand-up fight, the fair contest of armor versus armor. It embraced what many considered dishonorable tactics: ambush, hit and run, refusal of direct engagement, and proved these tactics more effective than traditional military honor allowed. This challenged deeply held beliefs about courage and cowardice, about fighting fair and winning dirty, about the kind of warfare that free men should practice. Compare the Hellcat to its German counterparts, the Jagdpanzer IV or the Hetzer, and you see different philosophies of national character expressed in steel. German tank destroyers prioritized protection and firepower, accepting limited mobility in exchange for survivability. They reflected a military culture built on discipline, order, and holding ground regardless of cost. The Hellcat reflected American pragmatism, a willingness to break rules if breaking rules worked, a cultural comfort with asymmetric warfare that European militaries found unsettling. In the final months of the war, as Allied armies pushed into Germany itself, Hellcat crews found themselves hunting not just tanks, but the last desperate remnants of a dying regime. They pursued retreating columns, ambushed supply convoys, and engaged in the brutal urban combat where their speed became a liability in narrow streets designed centuries before anyone imagined armored warfare. Some crews died in these final battles, killed not by German armor, but by Panzerfaust teams in rubble, by artillery in prepared positions, by the simple mathematics of war, where even the fastest vehicle eventually runs out of room to maneuver. But for those who survived, the Hellcat represented something more than just an effective weapon. It represented a validation of American pragmatism over European tradition, of innovation over convention, of results over reputation. The crews who climbed out of these vehicles when the shooting stopped had proven that you didn't need the thickest armor or the biggest gun to win. You needed to think differently, fight smarter, and refuse to accept the enemy's definition of what combat should look like. The German tankers who survived encounters with Hellcats never forgot them. In post-war interviews, former Panther and Tiger commanders spoke with grudging respect about the American tank destroyers that hunted them through France and Germany. They described the helpless rage of knowing an enemy was out there, too fast to catch, too aggressive to predict, capable of appearing anywhere at any moment. They talked about the psychological toll of being prey rather than predator, of losing the armored superiority that had defined their experience earlier in the war. Many admitted that they feared Hellcats more than the heavier Allied tanks, precisely because the M18 refused to fight on terms where German armor held an advantage. The Hellcat's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Its doctrine, mobility over protection, firepower over armor, initiative over defense, influenced the development of post-war tank destroyers and influenced American thinking about light armor through the Cold War. The philosophy that created the M18 can be seen in modern vehicles like the Stryker, in doctrines emphasizing rapid deployment and network-centric warfare, in the persistent American belief that speed and technology can substitute for mass and protection. But perhaps the Hellcat's greatest legacy lives in the stories that veterans told and their families still tell, stories of young men who climbed into vehicles they knew couldn't protect them and hunted the most dangerous predators on the battlefield. These weren't stories of invincible heroes or guaranteed victory. They were stories of ordinary Americans who accepted extraordinary risks because someone had to, who turned vulnerability into a weapon, who proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to fight despite it. The day German crews laughed at the Hellcat tank was the last day any of them made that mistake. Those who survived their first encounter spread the word. The American tank destroyer with the open turret and thin armor wasn't a joke or a desperate improvisation. It was death on tracks, faster than anything they'd faced, aggressive beyond reason and more lethal than vehicles twice its weight. It was proof that in war, as in life, success doesn't always come from being the strongest or best protected. Sometimes it comes from being the fastest, the smartest, and the most willing to embrace risk that others won't accept. The Hellcat didn't win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it won something perhaps more important. It proved that American ingenuity and courage could overcome material disadvantages, that thinking differently about problems could yield solutions that brute force couldn't match, that speed, properly employed, really could serve as armor. And it gave thousands of young men who crewed these vehicles a fighting chance to come home, not because they were protected, but because they were fast enough and smart enough to survive in a vehicle that made no promises and offered no guarantees beyond this. If you fought hard enough and moved fast enough, you might just live to see tomorrow. That's the real story of the Hellcat. Not a tale of invincible technology or guaranteed victory, but a harder truth about what warfare demands and what courage means when protection is a luxury you can't afford and speed is the only advantage you have. The German crews who laughed stopped laughing fast. The American crews who fought in these vehicles earned their place in history the hard way, one ambush, one kill, one desperate retreat at a time, racing death across the battlefields of Europe and somehow, impossibly, winning more often than they lost.